the little touches. This is not the only show that does that, but I like a show that, for example, has something that they use, and then later on another episode will use the same thing in the same way. I know that sounds really weird, but you'd be surprised how rare that is to see that kind of a thing. To see, for example, in this case, the specific thing is the device that they were using to try and alter Sinclair's perceptions way back in Season 1, and they're using it here on Sheridan. It's a nice touch, seeing that kind of same thing being used for the same purposes. So, we finally start to see the Clark administration getting nice and obvious and overt. They're not trying any of the subtle stuff. They're not trying to break him psychologically or through various forms of torture. They're straight up drugging him and trying to manipulate him into this situation now. They have truly started to get really desperate. I find that interesting and kind of awesome, because it kind of shows, kind of in an inverse, and we'll see more of this next episode, just how bad things are getting for the Clark administration. They're losing badly, and they know it. So they're like, quick, it's the only thing we got to do this quick. I also love the logic. The one woman's like, why don't we just bring in his father? Well, no, that would be incredibly stupid, and the gentleman points out why. If we bring him in, threaten to kill him, and then kill him, well, Sheridan is now, much stronger. He's resistant. He is stalwart now. He has strengthened his resolve. If we're bringing him in, threaten him, and then, we don't want that to happen, so we don't kill him, well, now things are actually worse, because our position has now gotten weaker. That's no win. There's no winning with that. So, not on the list. There's also a wonderful bit, speaking of that desperation. The doctor says, all it will take is a matter of time, effort, and patience. Now, they have the effort, certainly, and they don't really have the time, though. I mean, they might have the patience, but they definitely don't have the time. I have a feeling that this is either them not being aware of how bad things are, or, and this is probably far more likely, not actually communicating to the rank and file how bad things are. So then Garibaldi is Garibaldi. I just got to say, I didn't quite realize how much Garibaldi, excellent props to the actor, by the way, had not been acting like Garibaldi until I saw him acting like Garibaldi again. Because he is full-on Garibaldi again in this episode. He'd basically been playing a different character before. I mean, I should say he literally was playing a different character before. But the stark contrast between that character and this character is so thrown on screen, obviously and overtly. Did you gulp? Who gulped? We have to go 6 miles with this thing. Come on, who gulped? Do you gulp? She didn't gulp. She's a better liar than you. I love that. I love that whole scene. And it's actually half of what this episode does to lighten the mood, which I'll talk about the other half later. But after the incredible darkness of how things have been and how things have gotten, we needed something to bring the tone back up. That's part of that whole flow thing. You want to have a proper flow to your storyline. And in this case, his flow is up and down. That's what B5 has been doing in general. I love how Garibaldi submits to a deep scan, knowing full well what that means and what that could entail. Curious question, do you think that had to do with his desperation to prove himself? Or do you think it was just because he actually trusted Lita? Or both. I suppose both is also an option here. I mention this, though, because I don't think for even a second that Garibaldi doubts his own mind on this one. So I don't think he was doing it... How do I put this? This episode carries an unusual tone of... I hate to use the word redemption, but I'm not really coming up with a better word here. Garibaldi did horrible things, and clearly and demonstrably feels guilty about it, and wants to frickin' fix it. The speech he gives Stephen, to Mr. Franklin, Dr. Franklin, God, is so obvious. It's so out there. He's like, no, you don't understand. You can't let Bester just ruin my life and not let me try to fix it. I love that. That is so Garibaldi. That is so opening up. Ivanova has some senses of that. Sheridan kind of does. Delenn kind of does. Londo definitely does. I'll get to that, though. So then there's the scene where the Resistance resists. I suppose that's appropriate. If I could just be blunt really quick, I've never liked the actress who plays number 1. She's really bland. Like it's like she's trying to come off as I am this strong, powerful leader who is desperate in dire circumstances, who trusts no one, and she never does it. She never nails it. It's so weird seeing her alongside Garibaldi and Franklin, both of whom are fine, and Lita, who's fine, and it's just I don't know. Anyways, so then Lita hits number one right in the face with the truth, and she believes it instantly, which is funny because that could still be a fabrication. But whatever. At this point, I'm just okay with the fact that they believe Garibaldi. I did find it interesting that Franklin says, if it was one of yours, wouldn't you want to know? And her response was no. I don't want to cast moral aspirations on these people, but I don't think the Resistance are really what we would call good guys anymore. I mean, they did bomb a civilian hotel in a previous episode because there happened to be targets of opportunity there, so they've pretty much literally made the move into I guess that would be guerrilla operations. I don't want to call that terrorism because that's actually not terrorism, despite what some people might tell you. But, yeah, they're definitely not what you'd call the good guys anymore. They also mentioned twice, actually, that Sheridan has been in captivity for a week. A little bit of basic math will verify the fact that that doesn't fully line up with what had been happening in the previous episode, but it could still line up sufficiently that he might have actually been enduring a full day of nothing in between each of those sessions. Debatable. I still adhere to my previous thought of the fact that he was messing with his conceptions of time, and not just in the obvious, it's daytime, it's nighttime. You can't have a sandwich at breakfast, it'll spoil your stomach. Wow, this is funny. I love this episode, but I have so much less to talk about it. I cannot believe the guard let Garibaldi in. That's hilarious. What I love far more, though, is he goes and talks to the inner guard and says, "Hey, did you see me on TV?" No, I wish I'd written this down, but it was a long speech. "TV is nothing but foolish and terrible information that has been put forth by the liberal media." I'm sorry, I laughed out loud. I actually laughed when I heard that line. I was like, "Oh my God!" These right here, these are the staunch Clark administration supporters. I don't mean like the people who are running the things, the people who qualify as the Clark administration. I mean, this is the underweb, the net of people who are actually supporting the regime. Morons like this guy. I love it. And then, of course, Garibaldi, being Garibaldi, of course. Don't you agree, Mr. Franklin? Absolutely, absolutely. Now that we have a common... I love it. There is one complaint, and I do indeed have a complaint about the Sheridan rescue scene. At one point, Sheridan grabs a gun off the ground, and a PPG specifically, and starts shooting one of the guys who was recovering. Okay. Then he shoots him like 6 more times, and then he walks off. I feel like I get what they were going for there, but they failed miserably at it. Just my opinion. There should have been something of a desperate animal in Sheridan, who, I remind you, and this has been repeated more than once, not just by me, but by the show, is the guy who felt bad for his enemies, seeing Sheridan just, as he gets more and more, just keeps shooting until finally he's like, John, come on. Let's go. We need to get out of here. There should have been more to that rather than I felt like it lacked punch. This is also true later. There is a scene, I can't believe I'm making fun of this. There's a scene where Delenn and Sheridan are reunited, which had almost no impact at all. I mean, I hate to say that, but it was just like, The only thing that it had an impact on was he's like, yeah, I'm fine. Well, okay, no, I'm not fine. And he mentions that it'll take him a while to talk about it. That is probably the one thing about that scene I liked, because it should. He has been through things most people cannot comprehend, and, to be blunt, never should. So yeah, it doesn't bother me that much. Or it doesn't bother me. I like the fact that he doesn't just immediately open up to her, and he just may never open up to her about what he went through. So speaking of which, let's talk about Londo really quick. Londo, Jakar perfectly used their political influence with the League and with their knowledge of how politics work to arrange pretty much the perfect situation so that Delenn is not involved, the Minbari are not involved, and the humans are not involved, with the League of Non-Aligned Worlds unifying in order to support the human movement to save their world. That's actually a brilliant masterstroke on behalf of both of them. You'll notice that Londo and Jakar are behaving a lot more friendly towards each other. This is probably one of my few regrets, and something I think is part of the Season 5 issue that we'll be talking about in, I don't know, like 2 or 3 weeks at this point. From my perspective, it'll be next week, but from your perspective, it'll probably be a couple weeks from now. The fact that certain character arcs and certain story arcs feel a little crunched. Because, I'm just going to spoil this, next episode, the very next episode, or the next episode, one of the two, we see Jakar and Londo being buddy-buddy, basically being friends. You know, there needed to be more of a transitionary period there. I liked the fact that Jakar didn't just open up to Londo. Go the next step with it. It was still nice to see both of them. It's a great scene. Veer is obviously very happy to finally see political power be put to a good end. Londo is ecstatic about this whole situation. Jakar is happy to finally support his allies. I mean, imagine what it must mean like for Jakar, who owes them so much at this point, to finally be able to really back them in a big way that's going to have a long-term reason to function. And of course, there's that wonderful back and forth. It's right for the political reason, and it's right for the moral reason. And politics and morality on the rare side, or excuse me, politics and morality on the same side, that is a rare sight. I love that little exchange there. So Ivanova's leading the fleet. She takes a much harder stance than Sheridan, but of course she does. She's much more militant, I think is the word I want to use there, than he is. She is far more than he is willing to be. I find it interesting that something I've been talking about this entire time is finally stated flat out in this episode, with Marcus being like, why don't we just go after Clark and say screw it to the rest of this? And Ivanova's like, no, it doesn't work that way. Now, she doesn't say it flat out, but she implies what I've been saying all along, that their enemy is not Clark. Their enemy is the Clark administration. Clark is not the problem. Clark is the excuse for the problem. And they need to be dealt with. They, remember from last episode? Because they do need to be dealt with. All of them. And this episode also is very intelligent about one thing that I was when I first was watching this, I thought they weren't going to cover it in typical fictional fashion. They just like, oh yeah, the good guys have joined back, join our side. It's too often in fiction that just everyone joins up and defects to the good guy side and then they win, right? I like the idea that there are two other categories of people who are joining or defecting towards the Army of Light. First group, of course, are the people who aren't actually defecting at all, who are just saying, like, yeah, we surrender, we'll work with you, and then feeding information back home. The second group of people is the group of people who aren't defecting, but aren't loyalists. In other words, yeah, we'll defect and join you in hopes for leniency with the trials, but we will also send information home just in case the insurrection fails, as is stated flat out in the episode, playing both sides, so that no matter who wins, they have a chance. That makes a lot of sense to me. And in fact, the guy who says that is basically doing that himself. He's like, hey, so I've got information. Will that buy me leniency? It is funny to me, and very appropriate, how many military officers involved in this whole Clark Civil War administration thing are self-interested. But of course, most people would be, so it's understandable. It is funny to me, though. Like, his flat-out thing, I wasn't responsible for it. That's what he starts with. I didn't do this. I wasn't responsible for this. I didn't send these orders, right? I'm not here to blame. And then he starts bargaining after he finishes his failed attempt at convincing her. So, I'm sorry, I actually meant to mention something about Londo and Jakar really quick. We know why Jakar's doing this. Jakar's doing this because it's the right thing to do, and because he owes Sheridan. Why is Londo doing this? I have heard many arguments about Londo's motivations at this part of the story. Why is Londo supporting Sheridan and making this stand for a unified galaxy? Why? What's in it for Londo? A couple of possible answers I've heard over the years. I'm not going to give my opinion. I'm just curious what you guys think. So some of the possible ideas I've heard is that Londo is still self-interested. He wants to be on the winning side, and he thinks this is going to be the winning side. Some people think that this has to do with the favor that he owes Sheridan for the whole Vorlon fleet coming. Remember way back when he was still back on Centauri Prime? So maybe that's related. Some people think that this is him attempting to redeem himself, that he is only doing these things to do better to the galaxy that he has wrecked. And some people think he is doing it because it is the right thing to do, because he does have a sense of morals and ethics. These aren't mutually exclusive either. Quite a few of these could coexist with each other. What do you guys think? So, I mentioned the defectors. Last episode, I commented on how incredibly valuable it is from a military perspective to have information on your enemy's objectives. Well, you know what else is really useful? Knowing your enemy's composition and firepower and everything, actually. Information is just super important in military engagements, right? So they're going up against super ships, and that's all they know. That's it. That's all they know. In the wake of that, I actually completely agree with Ivanova's plan. I really do. And for the same reasons that she outlines in the episode. It is funny in its own right, because I have a feeling that a lot of the Clark administration's plans for victory hinged on two fulcrums. Getting Sheridan to try and stall or dull the insurrection itself, which, as I've already mentioned, isn't going to frickin' happen even if they actually broke him. And two, these new Shadow Destroyers. Yeah, Shadow Destroyers. So if we're to assume for a moment that Babylon 5 is well written, which I think we can assume, they have had, what, a couple of years, maybe 3, maybe a little bit more than 3 if we're really stretching it, to reverse engineer Shadow technology, probably with Shadow Agents' help, and integrate it with their Omega Destroyers, and then build the suckers, and then build a fleet of the suckers. That's damned impressive. Either that's nonsensical because that's too good for the time period, or, this is the one I like better, home is wrecked right now, economically and industrially. Because if we have actually seen in real-life history, if you have a fervent need right now for war production material, you can make it happen. It's just going to wreck you in terms of infrastructure and economy, because you are going to divert all that stuff that keeps your society going, and your industries going, and your markets going, and you're just going to turn all of that to making tanks, or guns, or ammo, or swords, or ships. It's possible. Maybe. We're admittedly stretching this, but I do like that idea, because I love the idea that the Clark administration has, in addition to the more obvious things of creating this Gestapo state of obey and dystopian 1984 garbage, has in addition to that been ruining the planet from an infrastructure level, ruining the society, the whole system from an infrastructure level, so that even if the Clark administration was brought down, there's still going to be a mess to clean up, and it's going to take years and probably alien help, but we'll see how that goes. So yeah, Shadow Destroyers. I've actually heard people complain about Ivanova's speech, but I love it, and here's why. It wasn't pre-written. I mean, obviously, the line was pre-written, but in character, Ivanova didn't write out a speech and then have it ready to go. She just spoke from the heart in the moment right there, and she was pissed. She was angry. God sent me. I love that. I love it because there's so much obvious passion, and it's one of the few times I feel the actress manages to play badass Ivanova quite well. Usually she kind of doesn't quite nail it for me, but this one, love that. But more to the point, I love the idea. I mean, how many of you guys have heard badass quotes from history? Once more into the breach. We will fight them in the trenches. We will fight them. Those are all pre-written. Like, the vast majority of those really famous quotes were written in advance and then edited and then speechified and then re-edited and polished and then, okay, now we'll say the speech, right? Not many of those really famous quotes were said off the cuff, so to speak. Some of them were. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead comes to mind, but, So I love the earnestness of it, and it really feels like something that someone would come up with on the fly just because. Which brings me to my next interesting point. I love how Ivanova is very intense in the whole battle. Because she's right. They can't allow any of these ships to go. There's many reasons for that, but the most important one is information. If they allow any of these ships to escape alive, they have the possibility not just of pursuing the ambush, or of letting these ships reinforce the main fleet once it's on Mars or Earth, but also of letting them know that their big bad destroyers were destroyed by what is effectively a Minbari fleet. Like, there's a lot of reasons to not let those ships escape. Quick thought. You notice how human Vorlon ships are fighting human shadow ships? That's rather apropos, isn't it, when you think about it? I mean, it is our galaxy now, so I mean, so I'm going to go ahead and admit something that's going to make you make fun of me. I was crying by the end of the episode. Thematically, narratively, in terms of narrative law, it would make perfect sense for Ivanova to die. It really would. I knew that when I was first seeing it, and I knew it this time around too. And the actress really nails it so astonishingly well. She nails the portrayal of a soldier who knows she's going to die and it's not that usually when you see a soldier who has laid down their life and is in their final moments, it's all hoorah, or it's going to be okay or whatever. No, she's very honest, she's very human. She's shaking, she's sobbing. Marcus can't even give an expression, he's just crying silently. Sheridan is just devastated. He got out of all that hell to watch one of his best friends dying on a table. I mean, what the hell? But it makes most sense to me for her to die because she died for two reasons. First and most importantly, this is showing the cost of war. There's an old saying that soldiers always share the burden of the cost of war, but it's relevant because because I have this really weird feeling that despite everything, Ivanova wouldn't like if she was given the option to do it again, she wouldn't change her mind. She would still do it. She gives a wonderful line, which is actually a callback. There's more of them than us. There's always more of them than us. But she did it. They did it. They beat them. And that brings me to the really important reason why this would be so fitting for Ivanova to pass on. Why this fits, I guess I should just say. Because Ivanova's character arc throughout all of the show thus far has entirely been about her ability to do, her frustration at powerlessness, and her fears at being incapable of affecting her surroundings. It is when she has been portraying a atmosphere, an aura, if you will, of being in control even when she is not. And it informs almost every aspect of her character. It's the central pillar of her character, around which the majority of her orbits. So the idea that she died doing something, she died not being powerless. She had the tools, she had the resources, she could actually do something about it for once. For once. And it ties so beautifully back into that old speech. There's always more of them than us. And she felt so powerless in that moment. There was nothing she could do. There's nothing any of us can do against them. Them. Well, she did something against them. She delivered a crippling blow to the Clark administration. In fact, to be blunt, from a purely military perspective, this one battle right here, this is when the war ended. I mean, it's still going. That's how that works. But this is the battle that broke the Clark administration's back from a military perspective. They've lost. And she did that. They did that. Or we did that. You know what I mean? I'm mixing up my pronouns now. You get my point. It is, as I said earlier, a proper show goes up and down, right? We had some pretty dark times last episode. We had some lighthearted stuff with Garibaldi and some hope with what Londo and Shakar were doing. Uplifting. It is only fitting then that the episode ends on such a dark note. See you around, guys.